I've always found the history of an artist or band's name to be incredibly fascinating, as often the most memorable names can come from the unlikeliest of sources. So with this video, I'll go through some of my favorite origin stories of how some of the world's biggest bands got their name, plus the origin stories of a couple other bands who aren't necessarily big, but whose names are hilarious and or absurd. Keep in mind that most of these examples will be fairly tame in nature, as unfortunately, there are some bands whose names came from sources that would almost certainly get me demonetized if I talked about them here. Looking at you especially, Joy Division. I've picked out 12 of the funniest, wildest, and or most unexpected examples of how those artists name themselves, while explaining the backstory as best as I can. I plan to do more editions of this in the future, so if there are any other stories I forgot to mention here, let me know in the comments and I'll consider them for the next one. But without further ado, let's break these 12 names down. Music critics like myself get a bad rap all the time, but there are instances where our musings about artists we do or don't like can cause moments of accidental brilliance. Just ask Daft Punk. Before pivoting fully to electronic music and donning those famous helmets, Thomas Bangalter and Guy-Manuel Domem Cristo played in a band called Darlin, named after the Beach Boys song. Alongside bandmate Laurent Brankovitz, who'd eventually join Phoenix. Listening to their song Cindy So Loud, you could see how there were much, much better things still to come for all parties involved. Their two-track single would get a less than favorable review in the British music magazine Melody Maker, where writer Dave Jennings would describe it as, quote, a daft punky thrash. Even if by pure accident, Thomas and Guy-Manuel took that bad press and turned it into arguably the greatest dance music act of all time. Even after their first album Homework in 1997, the days of Cindy So Loud and that Melody Maker review must have long felt like ancient history. Ezra Koenig hasn't always just wanted to be a musician. He's also a buff for film and TV, and even went on to produce the anime-style Netflix show Neo Yokio. His interest in filmmaking also extends to the origin of his band's name. During the summer between his first and second year at Columbia University, Koenig worked on a short film inspired by the classic 80s movie The Lost Boys. He was watching it during that summer and decided to make a film inspired by it, but with New England as the backdrop. In it, a man who learns of a vampire invasion in the US travels to Cape Cod to warn their mayor about it. The title of that short film? Vampire Weekend. The film's titular character, Walcott, would also have a song named after him on the band's self-titled debut album, one they often close their shows with. The movie was ultimately left unfinished, as Koenig stopped working on it after only 2 days. Instead, a few years later, he compiled the footage he did capture into a 2-minute trailer. Let's just say he chose the right career in the end. Despite what their debut album cover might suggest, Led Zeppelin did not name their band as a reference to the Hindenburg disaster. Instead, it came about in the late 60s as guitarist Jimmy Page's previous band, the Yardbirds, had just broken up. Page had planned on forming a supergroup with his fellow ex-Yardbirds bandmate Jeff Beck, as well as 2 members of The Who. But upon linking up with bassist John Paul Jones, drummer John Bonham, and singer Robert Plant to form a new band, they initially called themselves the New Yardbirds. Not exactly scoring points for originality there. Perhaps this is because the Led Zeppelin name was initially meant for his supergroup. Keith Moon, The Who's drummer who'd been part of the group Page had planned on forming, suggested it. Since neither he, nor Jeff Beck, nor Moon or his bandmate in The Who, John Entwistle, wound up forming that group, Page ultimately got to use the name for his new band. At least, not before using the New Yardbirds name first to keep their new name under wraps before unveiling it officially, going under that name while touring Scandinavia. So what birthed the Led Zeppelin name idea in the first place? When Moon was asked to drum in the supergroup, he believed the band would go over like, quote, a lead balloon. The word Zeppelin obviously packs more oomph than balloon, so Led Zeppelin they became. They removed the A from lead to ensure people, specifically American listeners, wouldn't mispronounce it as Lead Zeppelin, and the rest is history. Emojis feel like a fairly recent-ish cultural phenomenon, but we now can't imagine a world without them. The Isle of Wight duo Wet Leg literally got their name while members Rhiann Teasdale and Hester Chambers were playing a game where they'd combine emojis to see what kind of band name each combo would make. Eventually, they combined squirting water and leg to make Wet Leg, and the band was officially born. However, Teasdale's ex-boyfriend, Doug Richards of the band Plastic Mermaids, claims he deserves credit not only for birthing the name, but also for helping write several of their songs. Quote, "For years, me and a couple of friends had lists of stupid band names. Anytime you'd think of a funny combination of words, you'd write it down. One of them was Wet Book. My brother misheard me and said, 'Oh, you should call it Wet Leg.' Rhiann wasn't sure. Seems to have worked, though." Regardless of how true Doug's story actually is, or if he's just a bitter ex-lover with an axe to grind, the emoji story is a lot cooler anyway. The band has, however, also claimed the name was slang for people who come to the Isle of Wight from mainland Britain.
Wet leg is an old Isle of Wight saying for people that are overners, people that come from the mainland. We call them wet legs because they have to get a leg wet to get over the sea to come to the island.
Nonetheless, Rhiann has said this about the name. "I think we liked it because it was just such a dumb name for a band. It's a good reminder to not take ourselves too seriously. When we had our first meeting with our manager, he wasn't so keen on the name and asked if we'd considered changing it to something else. We stuck by our guns though. I think it's important to have trust in your own bad taste, otherwise stuff just gets a bit boring." One of the seminal punk bands of all time has a more intriguing origin story for its name than one might assume. Initially, they were called Panic. Yes, just Panic, no At the Disco involved here. But since that name was already taken, they had to go back to the drawing board. Guitarist Greg Ginn, the band's only continuous original member, got the idea from his brother, the artist Raymond Pettibon. The name came from Pettibon's hypothesis that, quote, "if a white flag means surrender, a black flag represents anarchy." In other words, no, they did not name themselves after the insecticide brand, though they did like that their name reminded people of it. Pettibon also designed the band's iconic quadruple black bar logo, and also designed the band's album covers and show flyers at the time. The logo would be spray painted across LA, much to the annoyance of the LAPD. Nonetheless, both the name and their logo are emblems of anarchy and resistance, and Ginn describes himself as being comfortable with anything the name is interpreted as standing for. I get knocked down, but I get up again. Yes, the band with the silly name and an equally silly hit song has an appropriately silly origin for its name. Chumbawamba, the anarchist punk band who found mainstream pop success in the late 90s with their song Tub Thumping, have often given different explanations to their name when asked about its origin. 3 of Chumbawamba's members were previously in another band called Chimp Eats Banana, and those members used the name Chumbawamba amongst themselves as a running joke to see which member could come up with the most absurd possible backstory for its existence. One example is guitarist Boff Wally claiming they came up with the name while they were out busking in the streets of Paris, with a group of African drummers approaching them at one point. Says Wally, "They drowned out our weedy rock and roll with booming beats and mass chants. And one of the chants went, chum, chumba, waila. It just didn't sound right, and written down it lost its rhythm. So we changed it to Chumbawamba. It meant nothing, signified nothing, and it didn't attach us to any preconceptions." However, multi-instrumentalist Danbert No Bacon has claimed the name came to him in a dream, where he saw public bathrooms labeled not men and women, but Chumba and Wamba. Ultimately, though, the name is inherently meaningless and nonsensical, but very much open to interpretation, which is just how the band seemed to want it. There truly aren't enough bands out there with Simpsons referencing names. But alas, there can never be enough of those, and yes, that includes minor characters first introduced in the Simpsons comics. But Fall Out Boy has to be the most successful of those bands at this point. Mind you, it wasn't a deliberate choice by the Chicago four-piece, and some members didn't even know Fall Out Boy was a Simpsons character at first. After bassist Pete Wentz and drummer Andy Hurley had played in hardcore, grindcore, and/or power violence bands in Chicago, their next venture was a pop-punk act. But their first 2 shows were played while nameless, or under the temporary name Pete's New Band. They thus openly solicited name ideas from crowd members after finishing their second show's set, to which one fan, who clearly loved The Simpsons, yelled out Radioactive Man's Sidekick as a potential name. Though frontman Patrick Stump and guitarist Joe Troman are both big Simpsons fans, Wentz wasn't initially convinced, and therefore brainstormed new names. Stump, meanwhile, wanted to include a Tom Waits reference in the name. They tried going with a much longer name before someone yelled, "F that, no, you're Fall Out Boy." Although they considered calling themselves Forget Me Not, Short Story, and Unhappy Ending, Fall Out Boy won out in the end when they asked friends to vote on their short list of names. Legions of fans and close to 9 million albums sold later, Milhouse Van Houten has a lot to answer for.
I've said Jiminy Jilliker so many times the words have lost all meaning.
We've got to do the Jiminy Jilliker scene again, Milhouse.
In today's musical and technological climate, SEO and Google algorithms are crucial for an artist's success. Scotland's CHVRCHES recognized this upon christening themselves, as simply calling them churches with a U would likely see results about their band mixed in with results about actual churches. Thus, they replaced it with a Roman V just like the olden days and never looked back. In fact, they've averted a Google search crisis that has dogged other bands like Chuk 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 spelled with 3 exclamation points. More specifically, it was because the band members' parents were trying to look them up online. Frontwoman Lauren Mayberry has also attributed the V as a reference to her love of the genre of witch house, even almost placing upside-down crosses on both sides of the name before abandoning that idea. Regardless, Mayberry has stressed that the name wasn't supposed to have religious undertones. Quote, "There was no conscious choice to have something with religious connotations, because that's not the way any of us are leaning, but just to have a strong vibe that could be interpreted in many different ways. And the V is there just so people could find us on search engines, as well as a strong visual thing. I didn't think it would be so confusing for people to pronounce it."
If I leave here tomorrow.
Some school teachers are so bad they live rent-free in your head for life. This was obviously the case for Lynyrd Skynyrd, who named themselves partially as a mocking spelling of their old phys ed teacher, Lynyrd Skynyrd. Their name also acts as a tongue-in-cheek nod to the character Lynyrd Skynyrd in the song Hello Mutta, Hello Futta by Alan Sherman.
You remember Lynyrd Skynyrd?
The band had good reason to be bitter about their old gym teacher, as Coach Skinner was a tyrant to the members in their youth. Skinner would frequently send them to the principal's office and get them in trouble for things as trivial as growing their hair too long. Revenge is a dish best served cold, though, as Skinner would eventually swallow his pride and introduce the band one night before a show. A classic example of students succeeding in spite of their educator.
Just got home from Illinois, locked the front door, oh boy.
The origin of CCR's band name, that of course being Creedence Clearwater Revival, is a 3-headed monster. The band, initially called the Blue Velvets, were named the Gollywogs by their record label without their knowledge or consent upon releasing their debut single. The Creedence part was actually named after John Fogerty's friend, Creedence Newball, after which they added a third E to the name. Clearwater came from the band's love of nature and the environment, as they'd been watching an ad from the Olympia Brewing Company on TV with Clearwater prominently featured. Lastly, Revival originated from the band's desire to revive rock and roll sounds from the 1950s in a time when America had the Vietnam War as its backdrop. John Fogerty himself has explained the origin of the Clearwater part in particular.
I was watching television, and on comes this beautiful commercial. It was a beer commercial, and it was showing scenes of an idyllic green forest, and it was so lush and wonderful. I loved it. Right after that commercial, there was another commercial in black and white. It was an anti-pollution commercial, and at the end of that black and white commercial, it said, "If you want to change this, write to Clearwater, Washington." I thought about it a minute, and I liked the idea of clean water, but in my mind I turned it over and decided Clearwater was a better word. Creedence was a name that had come up and down a couple of times in the last 2 months. Wow, Clearwater Creedence. Well, of course, I swapped that over. Creedence Clearwater, and I got really excited. I love that idea, but it's not complete. I thought we're trying to have a revitalization, a renewal, a revival. Creedence Clearwater Revival.
The most ridiculous name I've shown you so far, this band was never as popular as most others here, but the Flying Burrito Brothers name is inherently wild enough to merit screen time. This band, known in part for the presence of the late Graham Parsons and his former bandmate in the Byrds, Chris Hillman, were a loose mishmash of artists from other bands like the International Submarine Band and The Remains. There were only a handful of official members, as other artists would frequently just come in and jam with them whenever they wanted, but neither Parsons nor Hillman had formed the initial Flying Burrito Brothers band. These LA country rockers cut their teeth jamming at iconic local venues like the Whiskey A Go-Go and the Palomino. They've also gone under simply the Burrito Brothers, the Burritos, and Burrito Deluxe, but the origin of the musical Flying Burrito verse has been debated, as it has been attributed as both Parsons and Hillman's idea and that of the original members. It has often been cited as the latter though, as those members didn't particularly want fame, so they let Parsons and Hillman have the name. Though there isn't a super specific origin for it, it's easy to assume the burrito is representative of musical fusion like the different food items in a burrito, while the flying part is emblematic of the transient nature of its members. A plausible interpretation, but still a deeply silly name. A name as inherently asinine as Diarrhea Planet would usually be a telltale sign that we are officially running out of band names. But the hilarious, if gross, name of these Nashville garage punks is very much by design. When the band formed in 2009 in two members' dorm rooms at Nashville's Belmont University, the entire project was meant to be purposely annoying. Their record label boss at Infinity Cat Recordings, Bob Orrell, caught wind of the band when member Jordan Smith interned at the label, and was immediately repulsed by their name, needing his sons to convince him to watch the band play live. Quote, "I started hearing music that he was making, and then he told me the name of his band. I said that is absolutely my most hated word in the English language. Like there is no word that I hate more. Now here I am walking around wearing Diarrhea Planet t-shirts all the time." Smith himself has explained the origin as being a challenge amongst themselves to dream up the most revolting band name they could. "We were joking about making a really ridiculous noise band that would just be super irritating to every single person, and we tried to think of the most irritating band name that we could think of. I knew it had to have the word diarrhea in it because it can't have any real cuss words in it. That's too obvious. We were trying to be annoying, so we came up with something immature. It was Diarrhea Planet, and we thought it was really funny." Though guitarist Evan Bird claims, perhaps fully joking, that the name originated from them using a Caesar cipher to decode text that spelled the name Diarrhea Planet out, Jordan's story is better regardless. Thanks so much for watching. What did you think of this video? What do you think is the craziest band name origin story? Which of those stories do you want to see me cover in future videos? Which aspects of these origin stories did I not talk about? Let me know in the comments, and as always, if you're new here, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and if you're able to, support me on Patreon. This has been Sound and Vision, and I'll see you next time.